2012 will see major changes in Mexican politics when voters choose a new president. And if opinion polls are to be believed, possibly a new governing party. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Lisa Fletcher. On July 1st this year, Mexicans will go to the polls to choose a new president, as well as senators and federal deputies. Mexico is in its 6th year of a crackdown against organized crime that has caused violence to flare in states that are on the drug route to the United States. More than 50,000 have been killed just since 2006. And the economy is a big election issue. There's an increasing inequality between rich and poor. Political paralysis has meant President Calderón has been unable to push through some reforms which many consider necessary, such as liberalizing the labor market. So let's look at the main parties and candidates running in the election. First, there's the Institutional Revolutionary Party, also known as the PRI. It ruled Mexico as a one-party state for most of the last century, but then it lost power in 2000. Its candidate for 2012 is Enrique Peña Nieto. He's a former governor of Mexico State. The Democratic Revolutionary Party, or PRD, is an offshoot of the PRI party. Its candidate is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a former mayor of Mexico City. He lost in the 2006 election, but contested the results and led weeks of protest in the capital. The ruling National Action Party, known as PAN, is the current party of President Felipe Calderón. It's not yet known who its candidate will be in 2012. Al Jazeera's Adam Ramey explored the major issues that are likely to define July's presidential election and sent us this report from Mexico City.
I'm here on the edge of Mexico City where millions of poor people live, and it's these communities that will play a big part in deciding just who the next president of Mexico is. The election in July will revolve around a lot of key issues, but the people here tell us that the main things on their mind are the economy and security. As far as the economy goes, more than half of all Mexicans live in abject poverty on about $150 a month. The current president said he would change that, but in fact, there are 13 million more people now in poverty than when he took office. As far as security is concerned, people who live in these neighborhoods that ring the capital say they want the next president to help them bring down the levels of robbery, kidnapping, and killing they see taking place here almost every day. But across the country, the main issue for security is for someone to help people bring down the levels of killing they've seen happening in Mexico since President Felipe Calderón launched a war against drug gangs in 2006. Many voters say that's the issue they're voting for, and they want the next president to solve that problem. The two leading candidates say the way to address it isn't by sending the military and the police into battle with drug cartels, but instead to provide opportunities to Mexicans. And they say they'll do that by offering more social programs and education.
Well, given these issues of drug violence and growing poverty, why is Mexico's election important to the region? To discuss this, we're joined from Mexico City by Manuel Camacho Solis, Mexico's former Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He's also the former mayor of Mexico City and a supporter of the PRD party. In the studio, we have Christopher Wilson, who works on Mexico's economy and U.S.-Mexico border affairs at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. And we also have Daniel Brito of the Drug Policy Alliance, a group that promotes alternatives to current drug policy. He has studied Mexico's drug war. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Camacho Solis, I want to start with you. Mexico's 2012 election is being called the most decisive in the country's history. What's at stake?
I think it's decisive. It's the opportunity to strengthen the institutions, democracy, rule of law, and the possibility of having a better development strategy with more social justice, or to keep on the inertia of weak institutions, violence, corruption. I think it's a very important election, not only because it's going to be the most important election in a Spanish-speaking country this year, but because it's in a moment in history in which it can make a big difference.
And as you mentioned, the next president is going to have to confront violent drug cartels, a failing economy, a failing education system, and a lack of security. In fact, There's concern among some Mexicans about how fragile the security situation is and how it's going to impact the election. Some 50,000 people have been killed since President Calderon announced the war on drugs in 2006. Mexico's drug cartels have adopted increasingly dangerous and sophisticated methods, using grenade launchers, automatic weapons, and even body armor. And they're interfering in elections. In 2010, some candidates were intimidated and some were even killed. And voter turnout was low because of the fear of violence and intimidation in the polls. Daniel Brito, drug cartels have a history of interfering in both the local and the state elections. What is the likelihood that they will be able to interfere in federal elections, and if so, to what degree?
Well, it's unclear to what degree they're actually interested in which party wins. They're money-making organizations. And so we've had accusations from President Calderon saying that if the PRI wins in 2012, then the cartels will take over the country. That's obviously a politically motivated statement. Whether it's true or not, we'll have to see. Also, that involved in that was President Calderon was upset that his sister lost an election in the state of Michoacan, and he chose to blame the drug cartels. And the truth of that will be established in time, but it's unclear right now. Cartels, though, are essentially money-making organizations, and to the degree that they engage with politics, it's only to the degree that they need to in order to continue making profits. So as far as their political interests, some people in Washington say that they're essentially insurgents, that they're terrorists and they want to take over the state. And I think that's really overblown and dangerous rhetoric. What they are is organized crime, and the drug war has artificially inflated the price of their products and guaranteed them monopoly profits. And as long as that is the dynamic, the drug war, the militarization of the drug war will continue to make this security situation much worse and not better.
Mr. Solis, are these drug cartels essentially terrorists? Is their objective to take over the government?
No, I agree with what has been said. They are business organizations. Yes, they represent a huge problem in terms of violence and also of corruption of institutions. But again, what's important now is if the country has the possibility to change or not. Because if we just keep following the same road as we have followed, it's not going to be enough. So we have to bet on democracy, on citizens' participation, and the risks are there even during the elections. But the more enthusiasm, the more mobilization that takes place in the country, the lower the risk will be. The worst case scenario would be people not caring about elections anymore and thinking that nothing is going to improve. Therefore, we really need something that generates hope, and I think that possibility comes from the progressive alliance that has López Obrador as a candidate. We had a big problem 6 years ago because of the election results, and we have to make very clear that what Mexico needs is something like Lula and not something like Chavez. We need progressive reforms that strengthen democracy, rule of law, and basically we need a much stronger social policy and a much more effective development strategy.
Nearly a third of Mexico's registered voters are under the age of 30, and what's interesting is they see the PRI party as the party of change, and they say that they're disillusioned with PAN and the level of drug violence. How does that square with what's going on in the election?
Well, as you know, Mr. Camacho alluded to, the 2012 election takes place in the shadow of 2006, when President Calderon came in under supposedly a very narrow margin of victory and with contested legitimacy. And Jorge Castañeda, who was President Fox's foreign minister, was just at the Cato Institute a couple months ago, and he said that the drug war, the militarization of the drug war in Mexico, was undertaken under false pretenses for political purposes. And the political purpose was to consolidate President Calderon's contested legitimacy in the wake of the election. And the false premise was that drug violence was increasing, that he had no choice. And Jorge Castañeda very clearly established that violence had been decreasing up until 2007, and since then it's tripled. So what we're seeing is something that was taken for a decision made for a political reason, and has actually made the security situation much worse. And ironically, it was a decision that was made in order to establish legitimacy, but it's actually resulted in less respect for Mexican institutions, less institutional stability, and more problems with the rule of law, because the militarization of the drug war has obviously failed.
Chris, what does it mean if the PRI party comes back into power?
That's an open question still. I think that there's a certain level of concern that the PRI party coming back would be a return to the 70 years of single party rule that they had before the PAN took over the presidency 2 terms ago. But other people see a new PRI, they see a younger PRI, they see a party that's also has the capacity to govern. I think people are frustrated that in the past 2 PAN terms, there hasn't been the change, the level of reform that people wanted when they asked for a complete change of government. And so people want the reforms to pass that are being mentioned. They want things like labor reform, they want things like energy reform, they want the security situation to improve. And they hope some that the PRI could bring that, but others feel that the PRI would just be a step backwards into the past. And I think that it's a little unclear exactly what it would mean if the PRI comes back to power in Mexico.
Well, and what Peña Nieto has been promising are things that his party's actually worked very hard to block for the last 10 years. So are Mexicans to believe the campaign rhetoric and believe that democracy is actually in play as part of the PRI party and they're not going to go back to an autocratic, corrupt system? What do you think, Mr. Camacho?
Well, I think that Mr. Peña has shown what he is as governor of the state of Mexico. I mean, the elections are won there through the use of money completely out of law. His image has been strengthened by a huge investment in TV. And personally, whenever he comes out, he doesn't show that he has the capacity to manage a country that is living through a very complex crisis. I don't think that people think that PRI represents by any means change. Some people think that there has to be a new party, and they say, well, even if they are corrupt, they are more effective. But that's not enough for a society that wants to have a future, and therefore we really need change. And that change has to be the outcome of a progressive movement and also of a new national agreement after the election, because nobody is going to have enough power, enough votes to really undertake the reforms that are necessary to reconstruct the democratic institutions. And all those tasks require a level of agreement that does not exist right now in our country.
Yet it's interesting to note that you say it doesn't exist right now, but you noted, Lisa, that the PRI has spent years blocking some of the reforms that they're now advocating, and that may be true in a certain respect. I think that you're seeing a level of convergence on certain reforms. All candidates have said that they're interested in energy reform, citing the models of Brazil and Norway, which are not entirely different. So I think there are certain reforms that can be achieved, that there can be consensus found on, if the parties can just decide to work together for an agenda that they know is the right agenda for Mexico, and instead of just sort of regular politicking back and forth.
I think there's also a consensus developing that the drug war has clearly failed. We see this among many elected Latin American presidents currently in office and formerly in office. Just this past year, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which includes commissioners such as Richard Branson, Kofi Annan, and former presidents of Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, came out and said, building on the Latin American Commission report, that the war on drugs has clearly failed, and that in order to reduce violence, reduce the power of organized crime, we need to consider destigmatizing people who use drugs but do no harm to others, and that primarily that firstly applies to cannabis. So we need to talk about marijuana legalization. And so we have a remarkable consensus from the center right to the left among elected Latin American presidents saying that we need to consider something new because what we've been doing has failed. Clearly the drug war has failed. So we have President Calderon alluding to the use of market alternatives to reduce violence. That's understood as a euphemism for some form of legal regulation or decriminalization. President Santos of Colombia, the U.S.'s best friend in the hemisphere, arguably, says very similar things. If there's a consensus that will develop around legalization, he would be willing to consider that in order to reduce violence in the power of organized crime. And we also have, from the civil society sector, we have a grassroots movement emerging in Mexico, led by Javier Sicilia, of victims of the violence, saying that this has not worked for us, and we reject this militarized drug war model. And if you look at the PAN party primary, President Calderon's favored candidate, Cordero, is in third place. The leading candidate, Josefina Vázquez Mota, is not talking about continuing the militarized drug war model. She's talking about citizen security, but she's not talking about the drug war. She's talking about people being safe in their homes and people being safe from corrupt law enforcement officials.
Well, there's also a lot of talk about people somehow finding a way to coexist with the cartels. And in the past, the PRI party has negotiated with the cartels. Mr. Camacho, is that still a good strategy?
No, I think that whoever becomes president has a huge problem. It's not like saying we just have to change this and everything will change. Unfortunately, the level of violence that exists in the country requires a much more complex strategy, a timetable, but the orientation has to change. And the orientation cannot be to focus everything on the war on drugs, because now it's the #1 priority, not only in terms of public policy, but also in the bilateral relations with the United States. So we need a whole new approach in which economic development becomes central, in which the construction and the building of democratic institutions really goes through not only police reform, but through a new type of political relations and agreements in the country, and in which we really not only talk about the need to confront and reduce poverty, but do something serious in terms of diminishing the huge inequalities we have in Mexico. So this is not going to change by piecemeal approaches. It has to start with something that really makes people think that something better is possible, and I think that's the possibility of the progressive movement. And after that, as I mentioned, we have to call all the sectors of society, the different political parties, and really come into a new fundamental agreement in terms of economic policy, the type of institutions that are required after this presidential system has not worked through a divided government that is clearly ineffective. And we also have to concentrate on very specific programs in terms of the youth, for example, not only of legalizing or discussing the legalization of drugs, but for example, something that's working quite well in Mexico City is a massive program with the youth to maintain them in schools. And this has reduced the levels of crime in Mexico City, in the capital. And I think to make that a national program to include hundreds of thousands, millions of young people that have the opportunity of training, health, and sports instead of being left on the streets, those type of actions can make a very quick difference in different communities in the country.
Chris Wilson, how does the next president economically and practically turn things around for the country?
Well, I think we need to start there with the idea that they need to completely turn things around. I don't think that it's accurate to say that Mexico's education system's failing and economy is failing and everything is just in flames in Mexico. There have been really important advances that have also happened. If you take a little bit of a longer view, looking at the last 20 or 30 years, you'll see that Mexicans have greater access to education, they have greater access to health care. Just basic quality of life indicators have been improving, not fast enough, and that's, a more robust social policy is important. But things aren't in flames. There are significant positive pressures on the Mexican economy. Right now, the biggest challenge is the external aspect. The crisis in Europe, the United States is slow economically. So Mexico is facing those pressures. And actually the answer to those pressures is still to fix things internally, to do reforms of the fiscal policy, which really means making it so that Mexico can pay its bills without relying on petroleum. That would then free up space to reinvest money into the oil sector so that it can become productive again. But the labor market's probably the key here, which making the labor market flexible enough so that you can pull people into it, so that they start paying taxes. And that really will allow for the type of institutions to be built that I think we're all in agreement need to take root in Mexico to bring it further up to speed.
But practically speaking, I mean, we're talking about at least a third of Mexico's population that is off the books, that doesn't pay taxes. How does the next president come into power and say, it's going to be better for you to report your income than to keep it all to yourself, when we're talking about a country where 50% of the people are in abject poverty?
Well, I don't think abject poverty is the right word
that
for 50%. It's a much smaller percent that are in extreme poverty, but there's still significant levels of poverty, and you need to incentivize it. You need to have a way so that people, when they come onto the books, they get benefits also, like pensions, like greater access to health care. And so those are things that the government, through social policy and robust institutions, can offer as benefits for society, so there'd be a reason to pay your taxes.
Mr. Camacho, you had a thought?
Yes. What has been offered for almost a decade or several decades is to make a fiscal reform in which you take the value added tax and you include the taxes to food and medicine. And that has been the fiscal reform that is presented before the country. And of course, that fiscal reform is not going to work, is not going to be approved. So what we need is, again, new agreements. Yes, these new taxes, but with these new taxes, we are going to tax everybody. And we are going to restructure the social security system of the country so that everybody has the same chances. So you cannot change things immediately. And I agree, many things in the country work. We have to use everything that is working. But the level of frustration that exists in Mexico, very much aggravated by the violence, is not going to be satisfied by offering a labor reform. It has to be satisfied by offering a new future. And a new future means hope, and hope means to be convinced that the country has to follow a new path, and that path has to have much more equality than what we have right now. So yeah, from a technocratic point of view, yeah, you can discuss one program against the other, but Mexico is in a crossroads, and we really have to have kind of a historical approach so that people really start recovering faith that the country is viable, that the country has a future, and that we can be part of BRIC with Brazil and China and India, and not be judged as a failed state, or things that I agree with what has been said in your program are really not what's happening in Mexico. But that kind of feeling is pervading in the US, in all places of the world, and is also affecting attitudes within Mexico. So we cannot do huge changes, and the country is not really in a fire or anything like that. But in election, you have to really generate a new expectations, and those expectations can only be generated if there is a deep compromise with change.
You know, and one of the reasons Mexico's presidential election will be closely watched around the world, and specifically in the U.S., is the country's deep economic ties. In 2010, Mexico and the U.S. traded $400 billion between them, making Mexico America's third largest trading partner after China and Canada. Mexico has stronger ties to the U.S. than any other big Latin American country. Nearly 80% of its exports go to its northern neighbor. And with that in mind, Chris, that seems like even more of an argument for the country to economically get its act together.
I think that's right. I think that, you know, Mexico is tied to the United States, and there can be no turning back on that without destroying a lot of trade, a lot of jobs, a lot of people's livelihoods. So that in that sense, it means moving forward with its relationship with the United States, making trade along the border move faster. Right now, the border is a bottleneck to trade. The waits are too long, the paperwork too complicated. All that can be simplified so that trade is increased between the two countries. Now, that doesn't mean that Mexico shouldn't pay more attention to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is growing very quickly. Asia, Brazil, and so Mexico could also turn focus to those countries, but neither one should be at the exclusion of the other. They all work together, actually.
Mr. Camacho, 15 seconds, last word to you.
Yeah, we have the opportunity to change. That change is represented by the progressive movement, and nobody has enough power to really govern the country, so we need a new national agreement.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. That's it from our team in Washington, D.C. for now, but we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.net.